his realm. So he calls an emergency diet, an emergency German diet. Now, when we say German diet, we don't mean a bunch of Germans got together and drank beer and ate sausage and had a grand old party. What we mean by diet is it's a collection of all the German nobles coming together with the head. It's like a parliament, basically. The German nobles would get together, the Holy Roman Emperor was the head of this body, and they would discuss matters that were common to all of their different states and all their different localities. Because remember, Germany, as we said earlier, is not a unified country at this time. Wouldn't be until the 19th century. It's a collection of all these different princedoms or dukedoms and principalities. So he calls an emergency diet, Henry IV, and at that diet he denounces Gregory as a perjurer, an adulterer. He said that he was illegitimately elected and a menace to the peace of Europe. And he said, in essence, that basically Gregory VII is deposed. Now, he had no authority to do that whatsoever. But again, we have the secular authority trying to control the papacy. And so Gregory VII obviously excommunicates Henry for his statement and absolved Henry's subjects from their loyalty to him. So this is the first time in the history of the church where a pope issues a decree excommunicating a ruler and absolving the ruler's subjects from loyalty to the ruler. So in essence, he was saying that whoever wanted to come in and take Henry's place in Germany could do so. In essence, there would be civil war in Germany. So this happened. Some rulers, other nobles rose up against Henry to try to depose him. And so we had a conflict going on now in Germany. Henry sees the situation and it's problematic for him in his rule. So what he decides to do is he decides to make amends with the Holy Father. Now, some of the German nobles had actually called for a meeting in Augsburg, the city of Augsburg, to have Gregory VII travel from Rome to Augsburg and judge Henry IV. And so Gregory was on his way to Augsburg. He was traveling to northern Italy, and he comes to the little town of Canossa. And there's a castle there, so he goes and he stays at the castle of Canossa. And while he's there, Henry, with his family, travels down, crosses the Alps in the dead of winter to meet with Gregory VII in order to ask him for forgiveness. And so he's dressed, this Holy Roman Emperor is dressed in the guise of a pilgrim, very simply, just with a small retinue, his family and a few followers, a few servants. He comes to the castle of Canossa, he kneels barefoot to the castle door in the dead of winter, and knocks on the castle door and is begging Gregory VII to forgive him. Now, Gregory VII wanted to make sure that Henry IV was truly contrite, so he let him stay outside in the dead of winter, knocking on the door for 3 full days, just to make certain Henry was absolutely contrite. So finally Gregory lets Henry into the castle, hears his confession, absolves him, and brings him back into communion with the church. Now, you would think after that this is known as the whole Confession of Canossa, one of the most vivid images in the history of our church, this Holy Roman Emperor taking on the guise of a penitent pilgrim and humbling himself before the Holy Father. You would think that would have solved the problem, but unfortunately it didn't. A few years after this event, Henry reverts back to his old ways, and again, he tries to institute this practice of lay investiture in Germany. Gregory excommunicates him again. Eventually, Henry in 1083 takes his army down to Rome and attacks the city. Gregory VII takes refuge in the Pope's fortress, the Castel Sant'Angelo, and actually calls the Normans to come to his aid and help him. So remember, we had Pope St. Leo IX, who was concerned about the Normans coming to Rome. Now we have Gregory VII asking them to come to his aid. So the Normans come to Rome, and they push back Henry's army. Henry goes back into Germany, but while they were there, the Normans sacked the city for 3 days. So Gregory's reign became very unpopular towards the end because the Normans were in Rome sacking the city. A few years after that event, in 1084, St. Gregory VII dies. Now, this whole lay investiture controversy wouldn't be settled until much later, until the 12th century, in 1122, when the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor reach a compromise on this whole issue. And basically the compromise was this, that when they had the ceremony of investing the vassal with his symbols of authority, in terms of his temporal symbols, the Lord would bestow those. But the church, or the Pope or the Pope's representative, would bestow the symbols of office to the bishop. So when a bishop was both a secular ruler and a spiritual ruler, he would receive the symbols of a secular reign and a secular authority from the layman, but his ecclesiastical symbols of the crozier and the ring he would receive from the church, from one of the Pope's representative. So it was a compromise position that was reached. The ceremony would continue, but it would be controlled such that there was no ambiguity as to where the authority of the bishop to exercise his office as bishop was coming from. It was coming from the church, not from the Holy Roman Emperor. So we move on in our time period and now discuss one of the most fascinating episodes in all of history, and these are the Crusades. Remember I said in the beginning of this time period that this was a period of intense activity in three different spheres: militarily, spiritually, and intellectually. Now we have the Crusades. This is a time of intense military activity. Now the Crusades, as I said, are one of the most misunderstood events in all of Western civilization, in all of the history of the church. There are many, many myths that are perpetuated about the Crusades. Thankfully, there's been a lot of good scholarship over the last several years, over the last 40 years really, to help us know the real and true story of the Crusades. So many of the things we might have learned in school about the Crusades, especially if we went to school years ago, are more than likely wrong. Many myths were perpetuated about the Crusades, but again, recent scholarship has proven many of these myths wrong. Now, in our own modern day, when we hear the word crusade, many times negative images come into our minds. We think of these warriors from Europe, these greedy, savage European warriors who went to the Holy Land and destroyed the peaceful Muslim civilization that existed in the Holy Land. I mean, many of us have or may receive that type of image that's portrayed by the modern media and even, unfortunately, in some modern textbooks on history. And that is not at all the case. That's not the historical reality of what happened during this period of time. The crusading movement occupied a significant part of European history, so we have to take time to study it and look at it. The Crusades lasted from 1095 all the way up until either 1588 or 1798, depending upon how you want to date the end. Either to the Spanish Armada in 1588 or to Napoleon accepting the surrender of the Hospitaller Knights on the island of Malta in 1798. So regardless of how you want to date the end of the crusading movement, it occupied 500 years, 700 years almost, of European history. So it's a significant movement, so we have to spend time understanding what these crusades were. Now, crusading took on many different forms during that period of time. There were crusades to the Muslims, and there's 8 traditionally numbered crusades to the Muslims in the Holy Land. And those are the ones we're going to be focusing on as we go through these next several sessions. Not only were there crusades against Muslims in the Holy Land, there were also crusades to Egypt and other areas. There were crusades, as we talked about, to Spain, or in Spain. This is known as the Reconquista, that 770-year war that the Spanish Christians fought against the Muslims to liberate their land from the Muslim invader. We're not going to spend as much time talking about those crusades, but we will focus on these 8 traditionally numbered crusades to the Holy Land. There are also crusades against pagans, specifically in the Baltic regions of Eastern Europe. There were crusades against heretics, especially in the south of France, the Albigensians, and we'll talk about that in another session. There were also crusades levied against enemies of the church, or enemies of the Pope, and we'll talk about one in particular, the crusade against Frederick II. Now, if you look in your epic workbook, we have a chart that gives us a chronology of the crusading movement, of what happened prior to the Crusades, all the events that took place during the crusading movement, and even some of the effects afterwards. So in your appendix, in your workbook, you can find a chronology that helps us situate in our minds the linear progression of this movement. Now, there are 4 essential ingredients that made up one of these 8 traditionally numbered crusades to the Holy Land. 4 essential ingredients. The first ingredient was that for a crusade to be an authentic crusade, people had to take a public vow and actually take the cross to go on crusades. The first ingredient is to take a vow. If you wanted to go on crusade, you actually had to take a publicly professed vow that you were beholden to by the church to fulfill. This is actually known as taking the cross. So when you became a crusader, literally, you sewed on the cross onto your cloak. And actually our word crusade is a modern day word. In the time of the crusading movement, they didn't refer to these events as crusades, nor did the people, they refer to them as crusaders. Rather, they were known as cruce signate, those signed with the cross. So those who entered into crusades had to take a public vow and had to take on the cross, wear the cross. The second essential ingredient of a crusade is that the Pope had to call a crusade. The Pope had to call a crusade in order for it to be an official crusade. The third essential element of a crusade, or ingredient for the crusade, is that everybody who went on crusade received certain privileges from the church. And one of the privileges that a crusader received from the church was the protection of his family and his personal property. So if you went on crusade, the church ensured that your land would not be taken over or conquered by one of your rivals or by your enemy. If someone did take your land while you were gone, then the church would excommunicate that person. So you received this privilege of protection of your land and your property from the church. And the fourth essential ingredient of a crusade is that those who went on a crusade received an indulgence. They received the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin which has already been forgiven. And this was the prime motivator. The receiving of this indulgence was the prime motivator for most of these men to go on crusade. Now again, we have to answer the question, why did the Crusades happen? It wasn't just this notion of, these Western knights had nothing better to do, and so they decided to leave their land and leave their homes and leave their family and go to the Holy Land and engage in warfare. The Crusades happened because of the imperialistic ambitions of Islam. Remember, we saw how in 638 this holy city of Jerusalem fell. Now the Muslims allowed Christian pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. And this was an age of great pilgrimages where people went on pilgrimage all over the world. They went to Jerusalem, they went to Rome, they went to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. There was regional shrines. This was an age of pilgrimage. Just like you and I go on pilgrimages today, the men and women of this time went on pilgrimage very, very frequently. It was a big part of their society and of their life. Now what happened though is although the Muslims let Christian pilgrims go to the Holy Land, many times these pilgrims were harassed. And one in particular incident in the beginning of the 11th century in 1009, the Egyptian Sultan at the time, who was in control of Jerusalem, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now, this was a great affront, obviously, to the Christians. And this began a real negative relationship between the Muslims and the Christians. Later on in the 11th century, a new group of Muslims would come into the Holy Land and control the Holy Land, and these are the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks come down and they increased the harassment against Christians in the Holy Land. Now the real event that launched the Crusades was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Seljuk Turks were marching into Anatolia. The province of Anatolia was today modern-day Turkey, and they fought a big battle against the Byzantine Empire at this Battle of Manzikert, and they destroyed the Byzantine army. And as a result of that, it was a huge blow to the Byzantine Empire, losing the province of Anatolia. Because Anatolia was their richest province. It's where most of their food came from. It's where most of the recruits from their army even came from. And so this was a significant blow to the Byzantines. And they knew that if the Muslims controlled Anatolia, that it would be only a few short years perhaps before they were able to try to conquer Constantinople. So the Byzantines were in a very precarious position. So what happened was the Byzantine emperor wrote a letter to the Pope in the West and asked him to raise an army to send knights to the Holy Land, to the East, to help him to defend his empire against the Muslims. So that really was the whole reason, the whole backdrop for why the Crusades started. So what happened was the Pope at this time is Blessed Urban II. And Blessed Urban II traveled to France to go to a meeting in the city of Clermont. There was a small council, a little local council of French bishops that Urban was going to. And at this Council of Clermont, in November of 1095, he preached the First Crusade. Now Urban knew that he couldn't rally Western knights to go to the East to defend the Byzantine Empire. Because remember at this time, we talked earlier before the break about how the East and West Church had separated in that great schism in 1054. So the Byzantines were in schism. So Urban knew that no Western knight would leave his family, would leave his land, would travel and be gone from his home for 3 years and travel 2,000 miles to defend an empire of schismatics. No one would do that. So what Urban did was he decided to change the objective of the crusade. And what he said was the crusade was going to be about the liberation of the holy city of Jerusalem. And so he based his whole preaching on going to Jerusalem and liberating that holy city. Now he knew that the secondary effect of liberating the city would be to help relieve the pressure that the Muslims were exerting on the Byzantines. But the focus was not going to be on helping the Byzantine Empire. The focus was going to be on liberating the holy city. And he said that this pilgrimage, or this crusade, would be an armed pilgrimage. An armed pilgrimage. And that was a revolutionary idea for the time. Because when you went on pilgrimage during this time, if you were a nobleman, if you were a warrior, if that was your vocation, what you were trained to do, when you went on pilgrimage, you left your weapons at home. You took on the guise of a humble, simple penitent. And you walked barefoot, you had a staff with a small money bag, and you wore simple clothes. That's how people went on pilgrimage at the time. You never took your weapons. So for Urban to allow the nobles to take their weapons was a revolutionary move on his part. And it allowed this great body of nobility to use their vocation at the service of the Lord and to undertake this penitential practice of going on pilgrimage. So the response to Urban's preaching, Urban preached the First Crusade, and then he sent preachers all throughout Western Europe, into France, England, Italy, Germany, to preach the crusade. And the response was overwhelming. The response was overwhelming. It's estimated that 100,000 people responded to Urban's call. 100,000 people. The population of France, Italy, Germany, and England at the time was 20 million. So to put those figures into modern day perspective, today there are 264 million people in France, Italy, Germany, and England. So today, if we were to take the same percentage and the same ratio, if Benedict XVI was to call a crusade today, the response would be 1.3 million people. That's just amazing, the numbers. 1.3 million people would respond to the call and go to the Holy Land. Now, who could go on the Holy Land? The way that Urban preached the crusade was he wanted warriors. He wanted warriors to go. That was the whole point of the crusade. But the response was great among the elderly and among even women and children as well. Because again, this is the age of pilgrimage. People wanted to go to the Holy Land. They wanted to go to Jerusalem. They wanted to participate in this great event. And so of the 100,000, it's estimated that 60,000 were actually fighting men. 60,000 were fighting men. And of that, about 10% were knights. So 67,000 armed knights. The other fighting men were just archers and common foot soldiers. Now, why did they go? Why did the Crusaders go? Most of them went out of love for Christ. There's been a lot of recent research done on what are called charters that helps us understand. These are medieval documents where nobility to go on crusade was very expensive. It was very expensive. It's estimated that go on crusade cost a nobleman 4 times his annual income. 4 times his annual income. So take whatever you make, times that by 4, and that's how much it costs you to go to the Holy Land. So it makes those $3,500 pilgrimages to Holy Land seem pretty cheap today, doesn't it? Right, so take advantage of those instead of thinking about it. If you went earlier, it would have been a lot more. So it was very expensive for the nobility to go on a crusade. In order to pay for it, many noblemen they sold their land. And by selling their land, or they gave land to the church. And when they did so, charters were written. It was like basically a mortgage type of situation. You would receive a record of the sale of your land, or the giving of your land, or of giving up disputed land. You would receive this written record, and in the record, this charter, noblemen would say why they're going on crusade. There's been a lot of research done in this area recently, and it shows that this research shows that the reason why the nobility went on crusade was for love of Christ and for the sake of their own salvation. They were very humble and pious people who wanted to receive the indulgence, who wanted to participate in the call to holiness, and Urban gave them that ability to do so as warriors participating in an armed pilgrimage as an act of penance. Now, was everybody who go on crusade, a humble, saintly type of person? No. Obviously, there were people who went on crusade who maybe did not have the best and truest of intentions, the most pure intentions. But the vast majority, the research shows, were people who were motivated sincerely by a love of Christ and a love of the church. So Urban calls the First Crusade. The First Crusade was from 1096 to 1102. It's the only successful crusade of the 8 numbered crusades to the Holy Land. Bishop Adhemar was appointed the papal legate, so the Pope did not go himself, but he did send a representative, a man by the name of Bishop Adhemar. Now, the Crusaders believed that God was truly with them, that this was a blessed enterprise. And we'll see as we go through the story of the First Crusade that there are many different points in the story where miraculous things happen. And so that reinforced in their minds that they had God on their side. There were 4 main armies that left from Europe. One army was basically comprised of Normans, led by a man by the name of Bohemond. There were 2 French groups. The main French group was led by Count Raymond of Toulouse. Then there was another French group led by Hugh of Vermandois. And then there was a German group led by Godfrey de Bouillon. Now these armies take off from Europe in separate times. They arrive